Hello, everyone, and welcome to our very last session of a look at programming languages and concepts for blind and low vision programmers. Before we get started, I'm going to turn it over to Ty. Ty, it's all yours.
Thanks. Good afternoon, everyone. This is Ty Tomasi, Director of Accessibility, Belonging, Inclusion, Diversity, and Equity here at APH, and we are pleased again to be hosting another of these classes thanks to CDW. And I'm going to go ahead and turn our session over to Florian Beijers, who's going to continue working with us today. Welcome, everyone.
Welcome, everybody. As the people who can see. See what I did there. We have a bit of black outage on the screen, but not as bad as we had last time. At least the code should be visible this time. So yeah, excuse me to the sighted people. I will also make sure that bleep noise goes away. I hear it. I'm sure if you guys can hear it, probably not, but gotta be careful. There we go. So what are we doing today? Today we are taking a final look at our guess the numbers thing. We're going into some topics that we already covered. But what I mostly want to cover today is, okay, we've done all this stuff, now what? Like, how are we going to continue on from this point? Because I will sketch the events as I understand them. This is the last session of this particular course. Then in May, APH will have a coding symposium, which is super cool. There's a whole bunch of people giving talks and like talking about what they're really passionate about, which is fun. And then there's going to be more courses, but not by me. There's going to be other people who speak about their specialties. And that's essentially where I bow out for a while. I might come back. That's not up to me. But I will indicate like some path forward, like towards after we've covered essentially everything we want to cover today. So you'll not be left in the cold. We'll make sure that you guys have a place to land, and then yeah, that's where we're going to end it off for today. So what we're going to do today is a couple more fun things. We're going to look at essentially a number of really important big libraries or like packages or modules or whatever you want to call them. We're going to look at pip. We're going to look at some other things that all make it possible to, given the knowledge you now have, like if you've gone through all the sessions so far, you have a pretty decent grounding in like the basics, which means you can essentially start branching out into what you want to do. And I'm going to explain what you'd want to Google for, what you want to look into in order to do that. So our numbers.py might feature. We will see if we get to it. But yeah, I want to essentially take this class to give you paths forward. So before, in the Discord, we had a discussion about NVDA being written in Python and if that was a good choice. I was giving some advice there, and I was giving some opinions there. And I'm actually curious to continue that discussion after class. But there's some really cool points were brought up actually that are fun and that we can actually use to place Python in the landscape of what is out there, what is not out there, what should you be using for what? Because that's always the big thing, isn't it? Like, okay, we have like all these programming languages, which does what, why do we need to learn X over Y, and things like that. So that's super important to take a quick look at, like see what I, as a person in the field, as a professional, know are common languages that are used and why they're used and what makes them appealing. Going to look into some other coding tools, things like that. Just going to cover a whole bunch of sort of miscellanea today. So before I go into all that, I would like to open the floor for questions first. We've had some homework last week, the week before that we sort of covered last week. And then I didn't give you any this week because, well, this is our final session. There's a whole bunch of things being covered. So there would not really be a point to saddle you with even more homework. So you guys have had some time to digest everything we've covered in the last 3 sessions. Are there any questions I can answer at this time? This is where my chat helpers tell me if there's anything in the chat or in the raise hands or anything of the sort. Nothing? Not hearing anything. Okay. Can someone like key up so I know it's not just quiet?
Yeah, you're good. Go ahead.
Thank you.
You're
Appreciate
welcome.
it. Like, after all the tech issues, I'm taking no chances here. I don't want to talk to thin air for like half an hour. Thank you very
I
much for
understand.
confirming. Okay, so that's great. No questions. That's awesome. We can just start right in. So last week we covered the numbers game. We just did some refactoring. We talked about object-oriented programming, some, not a whole lot, just enough to get your feet wet, essentially. And that is where I'm going to leave that particular thing, because as I stated in both the notes and the class, that's a really like sort of tricky topic to really explain well. And I can absolutely do it, and I'd be happy to, but it's going to take a long time, and it's going to take a long time to make sure that everybody gets it. And in this kind of topic, I don't want to leave people behind. So what I did is I explained it in notes, I explained it in class, and there's resources on the webpage if you want to learn more to find the explanation that fits you in particular, because it's very much this needs to click a certain way, and therefore you need to hear it a certain way for it to get it kind of thing. So that's not going to be super featured, but it's certainly going to come up in your studies as you continue doing Python or Java or C++ or a lot of other programming languages that use this concept. So that is almost a programming language agnostic topic right there. Object-oriented programming is in most languages, not all of them, but most of them. There's other styles of programming like functional that you may have heard of. That's a very different way of thinking about a problem domain, which is not something we're going to cover today either, but it's a thing you can Google if you're curious. It's more of a mathematical way to sort of deal with data rather than like objects. So it's essentially you pass data from one place to another, doing things to it. But instead of changing the actual thing you're passing around, you're making copies of it. And so the original data stays intact, which can be very useful for all sorts of domains. So that's functional programming. That's a term you're going to hear if you're going to, for example, go to JavaScript root a lot, because JavaScript likes to do that in certain libraries. Object-oriented programming is covered last week, and then we have pip. And pip is kind of important because pip is cool. Pip is a PIP. It's a program that works with the PYPI, the Python Package Index. I'm popping my P's. I'm curious. Sorry. So pip is a program that lets you essentially pull in other people's codes. For example, if you were to want to make a sound play, when you, for example, the person gets the number right and gets the number, you can do that very easily with the play sound module. Like it's literally just import play sound and then play sound to play sound with the path to the file name, and it'll play it. And it's not going to open a media player. It's not going to do the same thing as we did in the first lecture where I played Rick Astley's Never Gonna Give You Up in like just a window. That's not what this does. It just opens the file, plays it, and then goes away without opening a window for it. So it's usually a bit more seamless to do it that way. That's what you, for example, would use as like notification noises for an app or things of that nature. Now, you wouldn't want to do that. You wouldn't want to open the media player every time you wanted to play a sound like that. That would be very, very spammy. You have a whole bunch of windows on the screen that just didn't do what they were supposed to do. So that's cool. That is very nice. And it's really useful as well, because that's where you'll find the shoulders to stand on, as it were. Like we all stand on the shoulders of giants, as we say in programming a lot. And I sometimes jokingly say it's like taking Lego bricks and sticking them together, because it's essentially what it is. You're taking someone else's Lego brick and you're sticking it on top of your Lego building, and now you have a new thing that your app can do. And there are very small packages like play sound, where just literally it just plays a sound. And then there's bigger ones like Flask that lets you create a web application from the ground up, and then Django, which lets you create a web application from the top down, because it essentially has everything included you might ever want. And then you creatively put them together and focus on the things that make your app stand out from everything else that everybody else is doing, which is cool because it makes building applications that happen to share functionality a lot easier. For example, if you're going to make anything that has users, you'll probably want some kind of login form, and Django will give you that for almost free. It's like write a couple lines of code, but it's pretty easy to build. Whereas if you build that from scratch, you'll be building for a while, because there's a lot of things you need to take care of. You need to make sure that your passwords are properly encrypted. You need to make sure that your users are stored properly. You need to make sure that when you have like multiple levels of users, things like admins and regular users, you need to keep those apart. You need to make sure that when a regular user has no way of getting to be an admin user if that's not what they're supposed to be doing. There's a process known as privilege escalation. That's more of a security topic, but a lot of these break-ins you hear about on the news, like these security hacks, are the result of improperly configured systems like this, where just there is a bug in the program that lets you be super user if you're not supposed to be. And a lot of the time, security is kind of the same as accessibility, where like the company's priorities are concerned. So security isn't really a problem until you get hacked. Just like accessibility isn't really a problem until you get a blind person telling you that your app isn't accessible. That's unfortunately often how it goes. And you can tell that they always sort of scramble the exact same way as well. For accessibility, usually this happens when you get sued. There's suddenly this big mad dash to make everything more accessible and as accessible as possible. And unfortunately, that is often the way to get things done, because asking nicely just doesn't always cut it, because, well, you're asking nicely, but then 1 million others are asking nicely for something else. And at that point, you end up at the bottom of the pile, which is very silly, but it does happen. And yeah, that's essentially what happens with security a lot as well. People will disclose these findings because people will always find them. If you make a mistake in this kind of thing, and people will find it, and then people will usually tell the company, because, well, there's actually programs you can participate in where you actually go actively looking for these problems, and then you can get money for finding them. It's called a bug bounty program, and that is a way for hackers, for freelance hackers, to make money. But there's also a lot of companies who don't do anything with the feedback they're being given. Same as accessibility again. Like they'll hear it, they might give you a thank you, and then they'll just like go off and do their own thing. Very similar to the, yeah, we'll take it under advisement, or we'll send it to the dev team, and then you'll hear nothing back from them for years until they suddenly get sued. So I was thinking about this the other day. It's really interesting how these two fields that seemingly have very little to do with each other are actually very like similarly treated, which is kind of amusing. But yeah, things like Django and Flask, which are both Python packages you can pick up from pip. So the command would be pip install followed by the package name, play sound, Django, Flask. Django is DJANGO, by the way. Kind of like Django Unchained, if you know that movie. But so those are packages you can just pull in. And then once you've done that, you can use the import that we've seen to essentially pull them in to your file, to your program. So obviously you would not want to import the entirety of Django. That'd be very messy. But you could say not from Django, import some other thing that you need for that particular project, and off you go. And that's where a lot of programming languages and a lot of programming paradigms are sort of headed these days. There's a lot. Most of the more popular languages have some kind of system like this. They have pip for Python, then there is NPM, the node package manager for JavaScript. Then there is Cargo for Go. And there is Composer for PHP. And there's Ruby Gems for Ruby. And there's all sorts of other systems that essentially let you do this very same thing. Take some work that someone else did and made available to the community, and make it available to your particular project at that particular time. And that's where you really start seeing the spirit of open source, where someone made a cool thing and they want you to be able to use their cool thing. So they put it in this index for other people to use. And the other side of that coin is obviously that they might have made a cool thing, but they also want to mess with the user a little bit. So they added some rogue code in there that does things that the package wasn't supposed to do. And the problem of standing on the shoulders of giants is that you don't usually check those shoulders very sturdily before you actually start using them. And particularly with Node.js, where JavaScript is a bit heavy on the amount of packages you pull in at once, because what you often see is that one particular Lego brick, as it were, depends on a whole bunch of other ones. So you got, for example, play sound. but placeout might need this and this and this and this in order to work. And then before you know it, these other things may also need things to work. And before, like, you know it, it balloons out of control. And this is pretty common, like I said, in node packages, where you will often pick up hundreds of packages for more popular stuff. And it's very easy to sneak code in there. Actually, unfortunately, the war that's happening here in Eastern Europe is also being felt in that space. People are putting like free Ukraine messages in all sorts of print statements that their code is doing and things like that. Sometimes it's very innocent, but sometimes it can actually completely cripple a system, which has unfortunately happened a few times. So this is where like the real what starts to transfer and like sort of cross over into the virtual, as it were. And it's really interesting to see that from a distance. I myself don't use JavaScript awfully much, but it does happen. And it has become a very popular contender for most popular programming languages these days, and there's a good reason for that. So yeah, that's about pip and npm and all these other ones. Let me pause here for a second again, see if there's any questions.
None right now.
Fantastic. And just keep going then. Very nice.
Sounds good.
Yeah, there we go. Super cool. So, next one, JavaScript, because you might find that a lot of the times this keeps coming up. JavaScript's everywhere, and the question might be, why is that? Even Visual Studio Code, the editor we've been using a lot, is written largely in JavaScript, and that is something that was unheard of for a long time. JavaScript was never meant to do this. It really was made as a sort of a toy language to make web pages more like interactable, more animated. And then there's a lot of things that were added to it over the years, which just made it a very mature language for a lot of things. It's actually, like, in terms of popularity, it's actually very close to Python these days, and it can also do a lot of the same things Python can. Now, obviously, that's not where JavaScript started. JavaScript started in the browser and sort of grew out of that environment because we got Node.js. And Node or Node.js is essentially an environment outside of the browser that you can run JavaScript in. And once that became a thing, once that became something you could do, it skyrocketed because it allowed for so many things to happen. Yeah, the things that you would primarily and traditionally need something like PHP or Python for, you could now suddenly do in JavaScript. And the people who like JavaScript, which is quite a few of them apparently, started making tools to build on top of that. And they built a lot of them. They built various tools to, for example, do web applications. They built game engines. They built stuff you can use for things like crypto mining or AI. Not AI is, I would say, still a bit of the domain for Python, but JavaScript can absolutely do it. Discord is written in JavaScript a lot of the time because Discord and VS Code and Slack and Skype and Spotify, they all written in a technology that turned up after Node came up, and that started out with.js. So Electron.js, just like the Atom name, Electron.js, is actually a really interesting and sort of ironic twist on what happened, because what Node.js did was create an environment to essentially no longer require a browser for running JavaScript. And then with Electron.js, and there's a couple of others that do this, there's NW, there is a CEF. Don't ask me what these stand for, I forget, but that's essentially similar things doing the same things. Some may use less memory, some may use different technologies to get the same thing done, but their essential MO is the same. And what they do is they wrap a browser around an app. So we went from no need for a browser, we'll do it on the server, to we'll use the server to make a browser, which is sort of amusing. And this is why so many screen readers get a little confused in these applications, because it's technically a web page, but it's also not. This is why you can go into browse mode in, for example, Discord or Visual Studio. It is, for all intents and purposes, for as far as the screen reader is aware, it is a web page. So you can do all the things you would normally be able to do on web pages. Question is, should you? Because often that makes it go slower. When a program essentially tries to be accessible, one of the first things they will often do is make it keyboard accessible. So you can get hotkeys to get to all sorts of interesting places. You can see this in Discord, for example, with the Control D to drag a particular channel or server, and then pressing enter to put it in a different place. That's something you could normally only do with the mouse, and certainly not something you can do with the browse mode. But if you're in focus mode and you use the hotkeys that Discord itself implemented, you can now suddenly use that functionality. And that is really how it should work, because at that point, you're not dependent on your screen reader's browse mode or virtual focus or Cur. All sorts of other like little names for this same concept of making essentially the web page into a document you can scroll through, Microsoft Word style essentially. And you can then use some kind of keyboard layer on top of everything else to make the app speedier. And you don't have to depend on the screen reader's browse mode, because obviously keyboard users who don't use the screen reader don't have that. So they wouldn't be able to use those, which is why often you'll find keyboard shortcuts happening a lot quicker than screen reader accessibility. The problem there is that keyboard shortcuts may move the visual focus, but not the screen reader one. So what happens there is that the keystrokes work well enough and you can go places, but it doesn't tell you where you landed. So you still technically don't have accessibility. And once both of those are united, so you have essentially feedback for the keyboard controls and you have keyboard controls, that's when you start seriously considering, should I be using the browse mode like I have been because I didn't have any other choice at the time, or should I start using it in focus mode or virtual cursor off or anything you'd like to call that? And there is actually always a bit of a trade-off there, because sometimes, and this is particularly a thing with JAWS, sometimes these new hotkeys that applications implement don't actually work properly with screen readers, because screen readers take the they take the hotkey that you're trying to press and they think it's for them. So essentially, when you press a hotkey on your computer, a lot of the time, particularly when using JAWS will first see that hotkey and be like, is that for me? No, okay, I can't do anything with this. I'll pass it along to the application. And this is why we have a pass-through gesture. Like, it's because I think it's insert F3 in JAWS and insert F2 in NVDA, or the other way around. But it lets you say, look, screen reader, ignore this next input because it needs to actually go to the input to the application, not to you. And you sometimes need to do this, for example, if you know that a key you're about to press conflicts with your screen reader's hotkeys. For example, I do this a lot when I'm in NVDA and I have to full screen a window, which is F11. But F11 is also the key you use to switch between your local and remote session if you're using NVDA remote. So I have to tell it, okay, ignore this, and then press the key, and then it works. So bit of a tangential shift there, but this is important because what we're seeing these days is that JavaScript is used to make these kinds of applications a lot. Like if you go on GitHub and you look for like things that are based on Electron or similar technologies, you're going to find a whole lot of applications that are based on essentially HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And to the question, is that a good thing? Again, it depends. So it's a good thing in the sense that generally, it is pretty hard to make an a web application that is completely inaccessible. People still manage it. Don't get me wrong; it still happens, but it is a bit harder, and it's mostly harder because, well, you can just do a little bit more with web technologies when they're not accessible. You still have your browse mode should you need it. You can get to essentially everything on the screen, unless it's somehow hidden. And what is really cool about that is that if you would normally have a traditional application that you couldn't, for example, easily reach the menu bar to, this is generally easier with an Electron or a CEF-based application. The problem is that it may be easier to get places like in a general sense of the word, in a big picture kind of setting. But if you actually want to get quickly from A to B, this is where Electron and friends start showing their problems, because this may not always be possible. Like if everything is not properly marked up with roles, so everything is clickable and nothing is linked or an edit field or radio button, you're essentially completely reduced to your JAWS find or your NVDA find to get places quickly, which is not a fun way to do things. So Electron, is it good? I think so in most ways, particularly because a lot of Electron.js applications are open source. So if something does break and you know some web accessibility basics, what you can often do is just download the code to your own machine using Git. And then you can just look around, poke around, see what happened in the HTML in order to figure out why this is so bad. And then you'll quickly find that, oh, it's a div that has a class of edit button, but it's not actually an edit button. So what if I just add an ARIA label that says edit to this? What will happen? And you'll be able to quickly make the application usable for you. And even if you don't get like the pull request for that accepted, you still get to have your copy with the accessibility stuff in it. So it's a lot easier to make an application work for you up to a point. Like if a program is not open source, which you'll, for example, find in Slack, then it actually becomes a lot harder to make things accessible, because screen readers were never really meant to do this properly. JAWS does it. JAWS has a system in place that lets you essentially look at the web that's in front of you, like the web page in front of you, and you can do things based on that web application. NVDA does not. It does not have a good system to essentially hook onto one particular element on the page and, for example, listen for changes. I was doing some research into this a couple of days ago for this class primarily, and yeah, there's not an easy way, for example, to make NVDA read incoming messages that I could find in the current channel, for example. What you can do, and that's what I essentially did, is go to the web version of Discord, which does exist, and there's a lot of Electron apps that will have a web version, because it is essentially a web page. So it's very easy for people to offer a web version to that. And at that point, you have access to, for example, an extension like TamperMonkey, which lets you run a bit of JavaScript every time the page loads. So at that point, I was able to, with the JavaScript knowledge I have, write up a little script that makes the message list poke the screen reader with a bit of info every time the message list refreshes, every time there's a new message, and it'll tell me what the message is. It's a bit spammy, but it does work, and it does give me that possibility. And in an open source application, you would do this in the application, and on a web presence, you would do this in a user script. And at that point, you have a lot more options to make things more accessible, even if you don't, for example, know how to JavaScript or how to NVDA add-on develop. So that is cool, but yeah, there's also certainly some downsides to this. And if you want to do that a lot, if you want to be able to do that, I would say JavaScript is really fun to learn to do this kind of thing. It's actually very simple, basic. You need to do these kinds of things. And then Python is, of course, great for writing NVDA add-on should you want to do that. Now, unfortunately, that process is not super well documented. But at this point, there's already so many examples that you could learn how to do it from just looking at those. So absolutely be able to do that if you want to. Should you want to JavaScript, you're going to not be able to use either of these. You're going to use JAWS's own thing, which I'm pretty sure is just called JavaScript. And there's the Freedom Scientific Developer Network, which they shamelessly ripped off the Microsoft Developer Network, if I may add. But there's resources there to learn scripting for JAWS. And that's also a really fun rabbit hole to dive into, because it teaches you a lot about how Windows accessibility works under the hood. and things like that. So that is a really interesting path to follow as well. I'm in fact going to be doing that myself soonish because I haven't looked at JavaScript for a while, and it's actually really fun to stay up to date on that. So yeah, that's the thing that happened. So we've now looked at JavaScript, we've looked at Python, we've looked at JavaScript, we've looked at several paths we can go with all of these. Again, going to pause just a second here in case people have questions.
This is Ty, and I just wanted to let you know that we're hearing some chimes and beeps, and I'm wondering if there's a way to mute those while you're speaking.
Yes, I would think so. I can certainly look into that. I do see that my NVDA appears to have taken a flight to vacation towns. Let's see if I can get that fixed real quick. Let's see if we can kill the chimes. Okay, that should have done it. Any more questions?
We do. We have Peter, who was the first to raise his hand. Peter, you can unmute if you'd like.
Yes, I'm here.
Go ahead.
Okay, go ahead.
This is Peter Donahue, and I just was curious to know what you were just saying about things like JavaScript and program and languages like that. Are those that were used a lot to write?
I cannot hear you over whatever that was. Can you say again, please?
Are languages like JavaScript and that, are they used to develop serverless applications? We hear a lot about serverless apps, and I was wondering if those are languages that are used for that.
Serverless applications you can write in various things. There is certainly a support for both Python and JavaScript in, for example, Amazon's platform to do that. So yes, you could use either or for that particular purpose. Any more?
Yeah, Melissa, would you like to go ahead? You can go ahead and unmute. Oh, try again, Melissa.
Hello.
Hi, there you are.
Hey, this is Mel, and I was just wondering, you mentioned Ruby earlier.
Yes.
What do you use Ruby for? My son really loves it. He wants me to learn it, but
It's a very fun
how
language.
practical it will be.
So Ruby, I'd like to say that Ruby and Python sort of came out the same time. And like there's maybe just 1 or 2 years difference. And Ruby came from Japan, and then Python came from actually the Netherlands. Guido van Rossum came up with it, which is a interesting one. So what's Ruby used for? Ruby is primarily a web language at the moment. There is a platform called Ruby on Rails, which is a way to develop websites and web applications. And it's very similar to Django that way. So it's essentially the equivalent for Ruby of Django. And it's a very expressive English-like language that sort of looks like I said, English. And it makes it very like fun and just easy to write, to rapidly write things like programming, like web applications. And what's cool about Ruby is that it's still being maintained just like Python. I do feel that developers are a bit tired of it, but that's not really a reason not to learn it because, well, developers are very much like magpies. They like the shiny. And they like to jump off to the new thing. And then it often turns out that later on, it was actually not such a good idea to do that. And then they go back to the old classics because they're battle tested. So Ruby is certainly still around. It's used for web applications. It's used for scripting, like automating things. It's used in some security tools. So yeah, if you like the look of Ruby, definitely go take a look at that. It's very nice to have.
Okay, thank you.
Not a problem.
Okay, and Eric, would you like to go ahead?
Hi, this is Eric.
Hi, Eric.
I work as a mainframe developer, and I have scripts for JAWS that helps JAWS work properly with the terminal emulator, for instance, not reading line numbers and handling some of the funky formatting. Is there anything of that sort for NVDA? Because I would like to switch, but that's one reason why I can't totally switch. So I end up just kind of using both.
That's a fantastic question. I have no idea. It's not something I've ever looked into. I know that I worked for a particular I worked for a company a few years back that did training for screen reader users, and I remember there was one lady I helped that did a very similar thing, but they were using JAWS at the time. So that's an answer I'm gonna have to look up for you. I don't know, maybe.
Thank you.
Okay, Peter, did you have another question? Your hand is raised. Okay, and Eric, I believe your question has been answered. If not, go ahead. Otherwise, I think we're all caught up.
That's fantastic.
Okay, everybody's caught up.
Very good. That's good to hear. So a big question, of course, right now is where do we go from this point onwards? Because we've done this class. We've done the class and we have spent 7 sessions together with each other. And we've covered several things. We've covered HTML, we've covered ARIA, we've covered Python. We have covered a couple of different parts of Python. We've actually looked into a lot of things like looking into accessible resources as well, and what to do if they're not accessible. Obviously, at this point, you'd want to move onwards to, say, you might want to find a job in this field, or you might want to learn more to be able to eventually be able to do that if you'd be so inclined. So how are you going to go about that? Particularly if you don't want to go to college, or you don't just have the funds to do a degree or anything of that nature, you think it's a bit too volatile to be in a college, because obviously that's rife with accessibility problems, and sometimes you just don't have the spoons to look into all that. And it's tricky because it's a really interesting situation where our job seekers are concerned at the moment. If I would say degrees don't matter, I'd be lying. It is definitely becoming less of a thing to have a degree in computer science, or a relative field. You can have a certificate as a web developer, or if you have some kind of demonstrable experience, that certainly helps a lot. But what I'm seeing, particularly in the last 5 or so years, is that there's a bit of a shift happening between having a degree or a certificate and knowing what you're doing. And particularly the latter, is a lot easier to prove in a lot of respects. So you can go onto, say, a free code camp. That's a resource that we have on the class website. And then if you do that, you can essentially make some projects, and you can stick those projects in your GitHub. And if you do that long enough, what essentially starts happening is you start building up a portfolio of projects that you can show off you have built. And at that point, you're like, okay, you have built this particular thing. You've built this project. Say you've built a cat photo app, or you've built some other things. And this is now a project that you can show off to prospective employers. You've made this thing, therefore shown off that you know what goes into making said thing. And just by doing that, you have something you can use, you can show off at, say, a job interview. So you don't have a certificate, you didn't go to college, you didn't go to school for this, but you do have something that shows off, look, I've been studying, I've been doing this, and it's been going well, and this is what I have to show for it. And that is a really important thing for people who think they don't have the required experience, I think. You can absolutely get somewhere doing that. I think it's actually really fun to look into how that works. And once you have essentially let's say a basic understanding going off, what is the kind of thing I want to do? What is the kind of resource I want to dive into? Well, then there you go. You have the tools now to essentially start making projects. For example, the Odin project does this. The Free Code Camp does this. I think Educative has you build projects as well. So there's a lot of resources you can go to essentially get all this stuff working, which is really cool because at that point, you have options, because it always feels like, oh, I need to get this paper, I need to get this degree. I don't have a degree, I don't want a degree. It's going to be really annoying to get all that sorted out. And this is an actionable way you can still actually move forward on these things. Essentially building up a portfolio of projects that you can show off. Because then when they ask you at a job interview, and we'll get to that in just a second, they ask you what you've done, like what you can, what you have to show for yourself, where experience is concerned. You have these projects. You can say, well, I built this using so-and-so, and I liked it for so-and-so reason. And that is already half the battle. Now, obviously, there's going to be more to it. And like I said, we'll cover that in just a moment. But yeah, you do have this. You do have something you can now use. And obviously, it's really unfortunate, but a lot of blind people currently are not employed. There's a variety of reasons for that. One of them is just a lot of inaccessible tooling and a lot of inaccessible job application procedures and all sorts of other things of that nature. By this course, I hope I've shown you at least up to a point that the inaccessible tooling need not be a huge issue, because you can usually find some kind of way around inaccessible tooling, use your own tooling that does work well. And that's just really cool, because that gives us so much more stuff to essentially apply for and be part of. Now, what is really helpful to know about these things is that, unfortunately, the applications are very different depending on what country you're in, unfortunately. Like, for example, where disclosure is concerned. Like, for example, in the US, I know that there's a lot of jobs that will have this thing at the bottom of the page that says, we are an equal opportunity employer. And do you want to disclose if you're blind or visually impaired? Now, what I do is a little bit unconventional in that regard. If the job is accessibility focused, I generally always say yes. Like, if this is an accessibility role, I feel that my disability can be an asset. In every other case, I tend to choose not to disclose, and I do that for a very good reason. I do that because I want to be there when the questions come up. So if I'm talking to a hiring manager and I disclose, that's fine. Like, I need, of course, I'm not going to hide the fact that I'm fully blind. But if I'm talking to a recruiter over the phone and they are trying to get me in, like, into an interview with my prospective employer, I don't disclose yet, because I don't feel that at that point I'm in a position to preempt questions, to explain myself properly, and to get a fair chance. And obviously, discriminating against people with a disability is illegal. But I think I need to not explain to anyone here how easy it is to circumvent that particular issue. Like, you can very easily just make it look like something else and off you go. So I've been heard this is somewhat controversial, but I tend to disclose when I can control the situation as much as I possibly can. So that's when I'm talking to my prospective teammates, when I'm talking to a hiring manager, when I'm talking to the person who gets to decide if I'm a good fit for the company. I don't tell people who are outside the company. I don't stick it in a form that someone somewhere might read. I tell them directly. And the reason I do that is because I know it's just easier that way. And it's actually good to start the conversation off early, because obviously there's going to be a few things that these people need to know if they're going to work with me, and that's fine. But if I give them several days to essentially have questions that don't get answered, I find that job interviews can go a little more tough than they probably need to. So that's how I handle disclosure. And that generally goes pretty well for me. Like I was more overt about it. I was more closed off about it in the past. I did internship where I just didn't tell them at all and just came in with my cane, which, I mean, in the Netherlands, we're known to be kind of blunt. So generally that is understandable and people don't give me a hard time, but I can see now that that might be come across as somewhat dishonest to some people. So if you want to do that, I'd say be a little careful with it, like, because make sure that you have a read on the person before you decide that that would be a good idea, because I think that might be jarring, not in your favor, as it were. Now, the job interview itself, again, this is very country dependent, because the whiteboarding that happens in the US for coding interviews a lot doesn't really happen that much here. Over here, the way interviews generally work is you come in for a conversation, they tell you what the company does, you tell them what you do, and then you essentially just get to know one another. And then there's usually a second technical interview, which can be any number of things. It's either like going to be a coding test that you do at home, or you build like I'm a web developer, so a lot of the times I have to build a small project that then I can then take them through. When you're going to do a backend development job, that's mostly going to be things like build a system where you can store users and things like that. If you're doing a front end thing, that's going to be more along the lines of, make this look good, or maybe design this mock-up. So obviously, if you're going to go to front end route, you're going to run into a lot more visuals. The full stack route, where essentially they've tried to smooch together front end and back end, does happen quite a bit these days. Again, particularly because of the advent of JavaScript being both on the front and the back end. So it's going to be a lot of JavaScript. That term is a little overused though, because full stack does not necessarily have to mean you need to be a super cool designer. That actually often isn't what it means. It means you can do backend, you can make it look sort of good, and you can do the front end logic. And there's a lot of logic in JavaScript these days where like you need to write up the components for React or Vue.js, which is Vue.js. That's another like JavaScript library you can use to make user interfaces. And again, a lot of JavaScript there, a lot of stuff you need to code up that you can totally do as a blind person. CSS is going to be trickier. Like you can learn it if you have the headspace for it. I do not. I have like a lot of brain space that I require for other things, and CSS is very, very low at the bottom of the pile. So if I need something designed, or I need to design converted to code on the page, I generally have someone else do that because I know I'll never be good at it. That is a me thing. It's certainly not something that I'm condoning in the sense that you can never learn CSS. You absolutely can, but you don't necessarily have to. And if you can't figure this out, it certainly doesn't mean that you can't be a coder or you can't be a programmer. So don't let that discourage you too much. Now, the interview itself, like I said, coding test. Sometimes I take a developer through the architecture of an application. Excuse me. Sometimes I do other things. Sometimes I have to. There's one time where we were essentially talking over how to write a Monopoly game in object-oriented programming terms. So that goes a little further than we have gone into the topic so far, but it essentially involves you telling what the relationships between the objects are and how one essentially fits onto another and how many of each we need, and essentially how that works. So that is a good way for candidates to show off their design skills in like a software design kind of thing, not so much a visual one. And then there is the whiteboarding / really difficult coding questions, which are hard, but not inaccessible, because it's generally questions about particular algorithms or particular coding gotchas in the language that you're applying for. So you can probably negotiate your way into like giving those answers verbally, or having your laptop hooked up to the whiteboard so you can type, or other things of that nature. You don't have to stand actually near the whiteboard and draw lines, because you can't a lot of the time. So I have found it very easy to get people to understand that no, that's not really how that works, and we need to find a different solution. That's also why when you're talking to a hiring manager, you'll want to make sure you disclose, I think. So, okay, that's the job interview. And that's a lot of where people sort of worry if this is for them, if this is possible, if this can even be done. I can imagine that some of this, what I've just said, may have sparked some questions. So I'm pausing again. Like I said, this is a last session where we're covering a bunch of different topics at once, and I want to sort of pause at the end of each to make sure we don't leave anyone behind. So if you have questions, this is when you ask them.
Okay, Florian, we do have a few questions. Would you like to take them right now?
Certainly.
Okay, Victor, would you like to go first, please?
Yeah, hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we
You're
can.
just fine.
Okay, yes. So I have a few questions. Okay, the first
go for it.
one is I feel I'm the one who's always asking about Orca. So I'm a Linux user and I'm always using Orca, but I think Orca is not as mature as JAWS or NVDA.
It is unfortunately not,
there.
no. Mm-hmm.
So and JAWS has all this, as you just mentioned, JavaScript. I don't know whether there is anything of the sorts with Orca. My second question is,
I'm gonna pause you here because it's easier for me to answer them one by one. So if you can please hold up. Yes, kinda. So last year or the year before, I know I was seeing some traffic on the Orca list where people were trying to make a plugin system for Orca. So someone did start this effort. I just don't know how far they got. So you'd have to look into how far they got, but it is certainly being looked into.
Okay, thank you. So I live in Nigeria, and a lot of differences in terms of how things are done elsewhere. And I'm working for a company who actually allowed me to, fortunately, allowed me to get an intern to work with me. So he kind of sees the screen while I'm working. So that's very, very helpful. But then I have problems when applying for some certain jobs that makes use of HackerRank and Codility. It seems that there are a lot of things going on, and probably because I use Orca, I'm not sure whether that's the case, but it seems like the screen reader can't really, read all the things that are going on, because it has some pop-up windows and all those kind of things. So one time, to circumvent that, I had one of somebody who was not really a non-programmer trying to help me read the screen, and it took a lot of time for him to understand what a list was, and all these programming terms and stuff. So we kind of slowed down the whole process, and it was quite difficult. So how do I navigate that, basically?
Yeah, that's a tricky one. So that's actually one thing I forgot to mention. So it's good you bring this up. There are standardized platforms for doing coding tests, and you've stumbled across a couple of them. HackerRank is one of them. Codility is one of them. Some of these are very accessible, and I couldn't tell you which ones off the top of my head, but I've seen a few. These particular ones are trickier. Now, I will admit to not having seen either for a couple of years now, and I don't want to really say if they are usable with any particular screen reader, rather like Orca or anything else. So what I could do is quickly hop on HackerRank and Good tomorrow and just have a look at how bad it is, because I'm pretty sure both of them have demos you can do. So if you can email me off list or essentially poke me on Discord or anything of the sort where I can like essentially start a dialogue with you, I can like look into it and see if I can give you some tips out of class.
All right, thank you very much.
No problem.
Okay, Deborah, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, so I have a great job, but I work with young people who will be looking for work and need to assist them in answering questions in interviews. My husband is a sighted programmer and he works with a lot of tools that are not accessible. So my question is, you're in an interview situation and the employer says, oh, we want you to remote into our server to test your code. You know, the Windows remote tool is not that accessible unless you install things on their server.
Yes.
Or the employer says, I want you to use Code Squisher. That's just a name I made up. What is your response in these interviews if you A, don't know if the tool is accessible, or B, you do know the tool is inaccessible?
It's a tricky one, because at that point you need to start negotiating, and you lose some negotiating power because of what they want versus what you need. So at that point, I would probably say, look, I've had experiences with Code Squisher before, and I know for a fact that it's not accessible. So if you guys think we're a good fit, I'm going to have to ask you to find an alternative way to do the coding test. You could give me a list of questions that I can just answer in line, or you could like give me a file that describes to me what product you want me to build. And at that point, I can do whatever you'd like. But at this point, we cannot use this platform for this particular reason, which has generally been reacted to pretty positively. People understand. If they don't, I think that's a very good indicator of what kind of culture you're getting yourself involved in to begin with. And that may be a very good indicator to rethink if you even want to work there.
Thanks, I'm muted.
Okay. Anybody else?
Yes. Donnie, did you want to ask a question?
Go right ahead.
Okay, maybe Donnie already has. Zach, would you like to go ahead and ask your question?
Yes. Can you guys hear me?
We can hear you.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Okay, so this is mainly just a comment on Deborah's question. This is coming from experience a little bit. Last year I did a little internship. It was like 6 weeks, and it was meant for those with a disability. And it was a game design or game development class, or not class, internship. Now they had us use the awesome thing, and I'm sure you guys know, Unity, and its accessibility.
Yeah.
Or
Good
lack
luck.
thereof. And now, while they weren't able to adapt, what they did kind of do is they kind of had me like do things I could do, because I could still use the menus, because there was a menu system, thank goodness. And they had me do that sort of thing, or they had me like look into different like ways to make games accessible or whatever using that framework.
Yeah.
I don't know exactly how that would fit in a coding test environment, but that's how I dealt with inaccessible stuff.
So this is something you're going to run into in a lot of places. For example, college, for example, the job, for example, a job interview. What you're going to run into is that what they want, like the exact thing they want you to do, is impossible. Because it's inaccessible, because it just doesn't work like they, for example, like installing NVDA on a work server just to be able to do a coding test is a bit much. And I think a lot of employees and employers would be very amenable to understanding that this is just not a very good way to do it. We're going to be spending more time setting up the test than doing the actual test. This is not productive. So at that point, they will have to fall back on your experience as a blind person, telling them what to do. And that's a very awkward position to be in, particularly in college, because you're teaching the teacher, which is not something you should ever be doing. But at this point, there is so little education for people teaching, people educating about what is accessible, what works well, that no joke, it's just not being taught. People don't know. Even in the US, where you have your ADA, you have your Section 508.
Yeah.
Stanford University has actually reached out to me several times for several reasons to help them with students they were having, because they just didn't know how else to help, which I'm glad they found me, but still that's a bit of a worrying situation where like a school needs to go all across the ocean to a person in the Netherlands in order to get stuff done. And hey, again, I'd love to help out, but it does highlight that there is a serious issue with the fact that a lot of tools are coming out that are not accessible, and a lot of tools that are not accessible are unfortunately very industry standard. So you have to then, as a blind person who may not even know the alternatives you can even use, you then have to teach the teacher what else to use, and then you have to hope that the teacher is actually willing to listen to you. And this is a very similar situation to the job interview situation, where you have to convince a hiring manager, no, I can't do the exact thing you want me to do, but what I can do is this other thing that I'm now going to suggest to you that's about 99.9% the same, just with using my own tools that I know work and that better show off how I would do work in an actual work setting. And given they need to know how you work anyway, generally that's a pretty strong position to take. But you do need a little bit of leniency in the sense that they are willing to actually listen to you and give you the consideration to do that, as it were. So that's why I say if they're completely unbending about this and just like, no, we're doing it this way or the highway, that does teach you a lot about the personality of the hiring manager. And it does, you know, in my case, it would throw up some question marks about what company I'm actually trying to talk to here.
Yeah, and I was actually when you were talking about the whole college thing, I'm gonna try to make this short. I could probably get into a whole conversation / rant on Discord, but
go for it.
when I was first in college back in 2018, when I first went in there, I was like, okay, I want to be a software developer. Well, I don't think you want to know how the first 2 semesters went. The only class that was remotely easy was HTML. The rest of it was Java, IBM on an old 90s mainframe with Rational RDI, I think it's called.
Lovely.
And Java, yeah.
Can be done, not fun. Yeah, it's an interesting one. Java is now actually a lot more doable with I'm pretty sure there's a Java development you can set up in VS Code now. So there is an option there. You have Eclipse, you have your things. But often what happens with Java is that they come with their own little tool that may not work as well. Myself, I started with Java as well back in college, and we used a thing called processing.
Oh, wow.
Which is essentially a toolkit to draw shapes on the screen. And you had questions like, how draw the Japanese flag on the screen. And the Japanese flag, for those who don't know, is a very simple looking flag. But if you're blind, you have 1, no idea what the Japanese flag looks like usually. 2, you don't know what you're doing because you can't verify what you just did was the right thing. And 3, the actual editor wasn't accessible either. So you had to go into a notepad, write out the code, paste it back, and then hope it worked. So it's really easy to break a college course. It's also really easy to fix if you have a teacher that's willing to work with you. And a lot of the time you do, and sometimes you really, really don't.
Yeah, it's very annoying. That's why I've done free code camp, and I've found that.
Yeah, that's a lot of fun. That is now accessible, which is really nice. Code Academy is now accessible, which is really nice. So even 5 years, if you look at 5 years ago, free code camp was readable but not accessible. Same for Code Academy. Code School was kind of bad. It doesn't exist anymore. That's Pluralsight now. What else was there? Like the various editors just weren't very accessible. So even 5 years, we gained so much accessible stuff that we can now just make this a lot. Like I wish I had this in college, honestly, and at college in 2012. So there's a lot of things that we have now that we didn't have then, and I think I'd have a much better experience in college. So I think on the whole, we do have the tools now to make college a lot more bearable than it used to be. It's just a matter of the teachers needing to adopt those tools, and well, that might take a while. So
Yeah.
Definitely do your research. If you want to do a college course, see if you can talk to the actual teachers that teach the classes to figure out what tools they use and if they'd be willing to accommodate you using different tools. Because if they don't, you're gonna have a bad time.
Yeah. Anyways, I won't make this super long.
All right.
So thank you.
Not a problem. Anybody else?
Not right now. Nope.
Okay, fantastic. So we've covered several things at this point. We've covered the positioning of several programming languages, why you might want to learn one over another. One I haven't covered yet is C++. C++ is what used to be a very popular language for a lot of things, honestly. Like Windows is written in that most of the way. I am reasonably sure JAWS is mostly C++. And it's certainly still a very powerful language for very powerful reasons. Like it does several things very well. You'll find a lot of C++ in game development, in driver. I think driver might be mostly C, but I think there's C++ drivers out there. Then there's also a lot of C++ in the tools you might be talking to from a different programming language. That's, for example, how Python can do data science. A lot of the more speedy stuff that needs to happen is done by calling a Python function, which then in turn calls something that is compiled in C, for example, because Python doesn't quite have the speed required to make it viable otherwise. And this is why it can be a bit of a bear to set up a data science or machine learning environment. So there's a lot of like moving parts to that, and there's a lot of things talking to each other as you're doing it, which is really fascinating, but also tricky to sort of get your head around sometimes. Now, that's where C++ comes in. Maybe people have heard of Go and Rust. Go is Google's thing, and Rust is not, reasonably sure. Go is trying to be sort of the new Ruby / Python / Java, like a sort of a higher level language that you can quickly get stuff done with. And a particularly well-known project that's written in Go is called Hugo, which is a static site generator. It's not something we covered in class, but it's essentially a tool that by writing Markdown, which is a very thin markup language, you can write up your own website. And that's actually very similar to what I do with the class notes. That's not using Hugo, that's using Jekyll, but it's a Ruby version of the same thing, essentially. So if you download my repository where the class notes are, essentially all you're going to get is a bunch of Markdown files, which is just a bunch of text with a couple of number signs to denote a heading, and a link has like square brackets around it, and then the actual address in parens. So it's a very easy way to just write your thoughts down and then have them be transformed into web coding. So that's what Go does. Rust is trying to essentially be the new C++, and it's making a lot of waves, particularly in various Linux Linux pursuits. You see a lot more Rust popping up lately. It's a very nice language. I personally don't know very much about it, but it's certainly on my list of to learn, or at least to look at languages. One particular one I haven't mentioned is Quorum, and Quorum is actually a really fun language in some respects. So I like Quorum for its for what it's trying to do. So what Quorum is doing is essentially give you a curriculum to learn a programming language in an accessible manner. It's a very like sort of English looking kind of halfway English, halfway something else looking language that Dr. Andreas Stefik came up with in large part. There's a tutorial you can learn about. They have like a game engine you can play with. They have you can use it to play audio, and it talks to, I think, the Java virtual machine. So you can even like talk to things that are professionally normally written in Java. I don't know a lot about it. And I opted not to use it for this course because what I wanted to do was use a programming language that you can immediately use for a lot of different things. Like we've seen that Python is used for NVDA development. You can write various programs, for example, Tweetscake and Quinter and Quitter and all the other clients, and QRead and all these other ones that a lot of blindness related products are written in Python because it's just a very easy language to rapidly get something on the ground, as it were. And Quorum is outside of its bubble as a teaching language, and you can do some cool stuff with this language. It's not used in like the workforce all that much, which is why I opted to not do a lot with it. It's certainly a very cool language to look into, though. I do highly recommend giving it a look, particularly if you're really just starting out. I think at the moment it's about as close you can get to what the sighted people get with Scratch. So it's an online editor, as it were, and you can actually have it play sounds and say speech and things like that. So if you really just need like a super basic introduction to things, and you just want to do testing where you have like ways of playing sounds or playing text to speech to test your logic rather than having to deal with like the command line and everything, Quorum is a really fun little thing to spend some time in. I myself found the curriculum a little bit chaotic, but it's certainly something to look into if that's a good way for you to learn. So I recommend looking into that. And with that little segue, I want to move towards the final portion of this course, the final portion of this lesson, and also the final portion of this course, which essentially is where do we go now? Because the course is essentially done. The resources that are up there, like the class website, the Discord, none of that's going anywhere, nor am I. I'm going to keep monitoring it for questions. If you guys have something to ask, you can do that. As I said before, I don't know when or if this is going to be repeated or extended upon at a later date. But there are certainly a lot of resources that we have put up in the various sessions that you can use to more closely dive into the various things that we have covered so far. So Python, HTML, ARIA. There's a lot of articles and books and resources also in the Discord channel for resources. A number of cool things have been shared. People have been talking about starting study groups to go through some of these resources. So if that's something you're into, you should totally check that out. The invite link will work for now. If that stops working for whatever reason, it shouldn't, but Discord being what it is, sometimes it does. Definitely have someone poke me because I can certainly put a new one up. Even yesterday, I got an email from someone who figured out that I made a bad and typoed the link for the session 7 notes. So if you couldn't reach those for a bit, that's fixed now. Thanks for reporting it. As for what I will be doing, so I will be here. I will be answering questions. And I will offer anyone who'd like it one-on-one teaching. So if it's JavaScript, NVDA add-on development, Python, JavaScript, HTML, pretty much anything computery you can think of, if you do want that one-on-one teaching thing where like you have the screen reader's perspective, I can absolutely offer that. I'm going to have to charge you for that. We can talk about it to make it sure that it fits your individual case. So yeah, come find me in whichever like platform you feel comfortable with. There's several on the websites if you want to talk about that. I'd be happy to have you, and like I'd be really happy to be able to teach anyone who'd like to learn more forward as we keep going here. So that's certainly something you can do should you want to. Apart from that, we've covered some free resources you can go into. So there is the free code camp, there is the Auden project. These are all very text-based, text-heavy lessons. They're generally also very interactive because like they'll have you do challenges. They'll have you do here is a bit of code, change it to make it do a certain thing. So there's a lot of stuff happening there that you can learn from. If you're more of an Audible learner and you'd like to like a good introduction to computer science as a whole and not so much Python or HTML, a class I can highly recommend is Harvard CS50, which is free. You can watch videos and you can do the practice problems. They are switched over to sort of an online Frankenstein version of Visual Studio Code that you can use to do your code stuff. And then the videos generally have captions and subtitles and all the things to them. And there's usually several levels of videos for if, for example, things move a little too fast or too slow. And I can highly recommend that course because it's a very good teacher. And they cover some very relevant stuff because they update it every year. So Yeah, even to the point of where if you looked at the versions of 2021 and 2020, you'd see them be on Zoom because, well, Corona being what it was, everyone was social distancing. So you can see that, and it's actually a really good resource as well. I'll put that into the resources. Like I said, going to take all the resources that are in the various session notes and put them together in a resources page. I haven't done that yet, but it's going to happen soon. I'll also put some notes up for this particular session, the final one. And yeah, that is a lot of things you can absolutely look into. Like at this point, I hope you are well equipped to continue your journeys, to essentially do all the learning you'd like. If you'd want to talk to a college or like some kind of university or a different institution, like a boot camp, I hope you now sort of know the pros and cons of doing that versus going for another way. And I really hope you guys get to do projects, just build a bunch of cool things and just show them off to your friends as a result of having taken this course, because you can totally do that now. Like I've seen people in the Discord make like cool projects, make command line tools. They want to expand the guess the number thing. I heard things about solver bots for the guess the number game. So a lot of cool things happening, a lot of things that are like making me smile and happy that you've learned so many things. That's where I'm going to leave it for now. I'm going to give like one more round of questions, and then I'm going to turn it over to the APH folks, who I'm sure have a lot of things to say about the symposium, as well as the other stuff that's about to happen. So this is my final time asking, is anyone good? Is everybody good? Are there questions that I can answer at this time?
We actually do have a couple questions. Deborah, would you like to go first?
Yeah, one final question. One thing that sighted teenagers do to show off their programming prowess is create apps for their friends' phones, Android or Apple. I think it'd be good for you to comment a little bit on the accessibility of app development. I'm back on mute.
Can do that. App development, you can do several ways. So for iOS apps, you're going to need a Mac. There's no dodging around that at the moment, unfortunately. You may only need it for building your app, though. Like there are various ways of doing mobile app development. One of them is React Native, which has our old friend JavaScript show up again. And you can use that to essentially write up your code in Windows, VS Code, if that's what you want to do, and then send it off to the Mac to be built as an app. This is something people do, and this is something you'll be able to get into the App Store with. And these apps feel very native, like they compile down to native elements, which means you're not going to see web views all over the place. You do need to pay Apple $99 a year to be even allowed a place in the hallowed halls of the App Store. So that is something you need to be aware of should you want to go that route. Having said that, there is ways of just writing apps for, say, a handful of people and giving them a test profile. So if you just want to do the showing off thing and give like an app to your mom or whatever, you can do that without having to do that. Now on Android, the situation is a bit easier. The way I understand it, the financials are simpler. You essentially pay Google like $40 once and you're in for life, if I understand it correctly. Android apps are written in Java or Kotlin, which is a sort of a younger brother of Java that a lot of people seem to like. I haven't looked into it myself, so I can't comment. But you could do that in, again, Visual Studio Code, Eclipse. Android Studio is the official IDE. It's made by JetBrains, which does not have a very good track record for accessibility, but it does sort of work. I know people who use it, and you can certainly like play with that as well. The language for iOS apps is Swift. But if you want to use Swift, you're very quickly going to have to use iOS's Xcode, which is on the Mac only. And while that does work, I found it a little bit clumsy to work with. Like, I'm not a full-time Mac user, so don't take my word for that. People do make it work. I know people who write iOS apps on the Mac, and actually with the advent of Swift UI, which is a new way to do UI development based on code rather than dragging and dropping things around, it's actually gotten a lot better to do that. If that's something you want to look into, there is the 100 Days of Swift UI course that you can take for free. It's essentially super bite-sized little lessons that have like a video and a bit of text. And you just do one every day. And then by the end of the 100 days, you've created several apps. So that is a resource I can recommend if you want to go the iOS route. I don't know as much about Android development though. So there's probably a really good resource for that I just don't know about.
Okay, Alan Lemley, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, how long will the Xerxes Don't Panic website be up? Is it going to disappear? Or is it going to stay out there?
No, that's not going anywhere. It's not costing me anything to have that be there. So it's just going to stay there indefinitely, unless I need to put it somewhere else, in which case I will give like a grace period where I say, look, the site's going to be here now. Click here to go there. And then after a while, it's just not going to do that anymore, but it's not going to go anywhere for now.
Thanks so much for sharing your knowledge and skills with us. So you've been a real good teacher. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much. I am really happy to see you say that.
Okay, Avery, would you like to ask your question?
Not a question, but I'm echoing Alan and extending my biggest thanks. I never thought I'd get back into coding, but having a blind teacher is extraordinarily helpful. And yeah, thanks for keeping the dream alive.
I'm so glad to hear that. You're so welcome.
Okay, does anyone else have, oh, we do have a couple more questions.
All right. This is where you tell me which one I answer first.
Okay, Gary, would you like to go ahead? Gary Lee.
You're not currently audible. Need to unmute. Okay, you're not audible.
There it is.
Maybe. Oh, there you go. There you go.
I had to find the unmute button. All
Not a
day
problem.
didn't want to work.
Okay, what can I do for you?
First I want to say thank you. This is a big jump for me. I did college in the 80s and mainframe and Unix development with VI and TSO and all of the old plain text stuff.
Very cool.
So I've got a lot to learn. I'm an old C programmer.
Cool. Well, you know where to find me.
But thank you. And actually, my last part of the question just got answered. The resources aren't going to go anywhere, so I can go get them and start figuring it out.
You can read them whenever you like. You can read them like next year and they'll still be there. You'll be fine.
Thank you, sir. And thank you, APH.
Okay, Michael Myers.
Hey, can you hear me?
Sure
I can hear you just fine. Go for it.
Hey, so this is actually my first session, so actually I'm near the end. Is there yeah. So is the information in the recordings for the earlier sessions somewhere I can find?
So the earlier recordings are in the YouTube, like the APH's YouTube account in the Abide playlist. That has the first 7 sessions of the recordings are recorded, and there is notes for those recordings on the class website, which you don't know about because you weren't here before. Let me put that in the chat. If I can find the chat thing. That is this. There you go.
Cool. Thank you very much.
Not a problem.
All right, Florian, I believe that is everyone at this point.
All right. Well, great.
Thanks again for everything that you've done with these classes. I echo everyone's thanks, and APH here is happy to help with this as well. And we want to again thank our sponsor, CDW, for all of their support of these classes. We will be picking up classes later in the summer. We're going to skip May because May we have the coding symposium here at APH from May 9th to the 13th. So please tune into that. And of course, July, we have quite a few different things that we're going to be attending all around the country. So we're looking to probably pick up classes again in August. So please be tuned in to get more information about future classes. And thanks again for everyone for participating.
Well, thank you for that send off, Ty. I was happy to do it. I've really had a fun teaching you over these last 2 months. Yeah. certainly like rekindled my calling as a teacher. I've not done this in a while, and it's been really fun to pick that back up again. So I was glad for the opportunity. Thank you, APH, for that particular one. Thank you, CDW, for making sure that they can pay me for this. And yeah, I will see most of you on the Discord, and if not, then I'll see you when I do.
Thanks again for your wisdom. You did a great job.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Florian. Thank you, everyone. We'll see you at the Coding Symposium or in August. Have a great day, everybody.
Have a great day, everybody.